What if the cradle of human civilization isn't where we've been looking? What if the birthplace of our earliest cities, our first languages, our foundational myths? What if all of it lies drowned beneath miles of salt water, pressed into sediment, lost to memory but not entirely forgotten? Before you answer, before you dismiss the question, consider this. Scattered across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, dozens of ancient cultures tell the same story. They speak of a homeland swallowed by waves. They describe great lands where the first teachers lived, where knowledge was born, where civilization itself began and then vanished. The Sumerians called it Dilmun. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis. Hindu texts describe Kumari Kandam. Aboriginal Australians remember sunken coastal plains. The Maori recall Hawaii. These aren't just myths. They're memories, encoded in stories passed down through generations, whispered around fires, carved into temple walls, sung into the wind. And here's the unsettling part. We're beginning to find the physical traces of what they remembered. If you're drawn to the kind of history that refuses to stay buried, the kind that challenges what we thought we knew about ourselves, then consider staying with this journey. Like this video only if it speaks to something deeper in you, and subscribe if you want more of what sleeps between accepted fact and forbidden question. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What corner of this fractured, flooded world do you call home? Because we're all descendants of survivors. Every single one of us. And the place our ancestors survived from? It might not exist anymore. Let's begin with a map. Not the one in your classroom, not the one hanging in government buildings. A different map. One drawn by bathymetry, the measurement of underwater depth. When we look at the ocean floor with modern sonar, with satellite altimetry, with technologies that pierce the darkness of the deep, we see something extraordinary. We see flat plains. Vast, suspiciously level plateaus resting hundreds of feet beneath the surface, stretching for thousands of square miles. These aren't random. They're not the chaotic, volcanic tumble of a purely natural seabed. They're continental shelves. Land that was once above water. Land where rivers flowed. Land where rain fell and grass grew and animals grazed. Land where people could have lived. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were lower. Much lower. Nearly 400 feet lower than today. Ice locked away so much water that coastlines extended far beyond their current reach. What is now submerged was then exposed, habitable, fertile. Indonesia and Malaysia were connected by a landmass called Sundaland. Australia and New Guinea formed a single continent, Sahul. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The North Sea was dry land connecting Britain to Europe. The entire geography of human habitation was different. And then the ice melted. Not slowly, not gently. The warming didn't creep, it surged. Between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, pulses of catastrophic melt sent seawater flooding across these low-lying plains. In some places, the ocean advanced miles inland in a single human lifetime. Entire river systems disappeared. Forests drowned. Coastlines that had been stable for tens of thousands of years were consumed in centuries. And the people living there? They had two choices, move or die. Most of them moved. And when they did, they carried something with them. Stories, technologies, knowledge, seeds, the memory of what had been. This is where it gets strange. Because when we trace early agricultural societies, early writing systems, early monumental architecture, we don't find them emerging gradually across the world. We find them appearing suddenly, almost simultaneously, in widely separated regions, each one carrying signs of sophistication that seem too advanced for a first attempt. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians along the Nile, the Harappans in the Indus Valley, the early Chinese along the Yellow River. All of them arose in the shadow of the flood epoch. All of them carried myths of a prior world lost to water. What if they weren't starting from scratch? What if they were rebuilding? Imagine it. A coastal civilization, not primitive, not scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, but an organized, thriving culture adapted to life along vast river deltas and shallow seas. They fish. They cultivate plants in the rich alluvial soils. They build on the flat, accessible plains where travel by boat is easy, where trade routes form naturally along coastlines. They develop systems of thought, language, art, governance. They watch the stars. They map the tides. They become, in every sense, civilized. And then the water comes, not all at once, but relentlessly. Year after year, decade after decade, the sea advances. At first, they adapt. They move their settlements back. They build higher. But eventually, there's nowhere left to go. The plains that sustained them for thousands of years vanish beneath the waves. And the survivors scatter, pushing inland, up rivers, into the highlands, carrying with them fragments of what they knew. Now ask yourself, where would we look for evidence of such a people? Under the ocean, precisely where we've almost never looked. Because underwater archaeology is staggeringly difficult. The ocean is vast, dark, and hostile to exploration. Most of the submerged continental shelves are covered in sediment, their surfaces obscured by millennia of accumulated silt. Visibility is near zero. Currents are strong. The pressure is immense. And until very recently, we simply didn't have the technology to survey large areas of the seabed in any meaningful detail. We've mapped the surface of Mars with greater resolution than we've mapped our own ocean floor. But that's changing. Slowly, painstakingly, we're beginning to look. And when we do, we find things that shouldn't be there. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kumbat, sonar surveys revealed geometric structures beneath 100 feet of water, straight lines, right angles, formations that looked unervingly artificial. When samples were brought up, some contained fragments of wood and pottery. Carbon dating suggested ages between 9 and 13,000 years old, far older than any known civilization in that region. Near the island of Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, divers discovered massive stone formations cut with flat surfaces, sharp edges, and step-like terraces. Geologists remain divided, natural or artificial, but the formations align with local legends of a lost city swallowed by the sea. In the Mediterranean, off the coast of Alexandria, entire sections of ancient cities lie underwater, including temples, statues, and roads. We know these were built by Egyptians, Greeks, Romans. But how much older might some foundations be? How many layers lie beneath the layers we've found? And then there's Doggerland. Once a vast, fertile plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, now buried beneath the North Sea. Fishermen have trawled up bones, tools, even fragments of worked wood. Core samples reveal peat, indicating marshland and forests. This wasn't barren tundra. It was livable, and people lived there for thousands of years. But we don't know who they were. We don't know what they built. We don't know what they knew, because it's gone. What if Doggerland wasn't an isolated case? What if similar plains existed off every major coastline? Places where early humans clustered because coastal living was easier, richer, more conducive to development than the harsher inland environments. And what if, when those plains flooded, the survivors didn't just migrate randomly? They followed the rivers inland, carrying their knowledge upstream, reestablishing their cultures in the river valleys we now recognize as the seats of ancient civilization. Look at the timing. The flood epoch, the period of catastrophic. Sea level rise coincides almost exactly with the emergence of what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture appears. Settlements grow. Pottery develops. Megalithic structures rise. Across the world, seemingly independent cultures begin exhibiting similar innovations within a few thousand years of each other. Standard history explains this as parallel development. Humans everywhere reached a certain stage of cognitive and social evolution, so similar ideas emerged independently. But there's another explanation. They weren't independent. They were connected, not by trade routes or empires, but by shared origin. They were daughter cultures, colonies, refugee populations, all fleeing the same drowned homeland, all carrying fragments of the same parent civilization. This isn't wild speculation. It's pattern recognition. Consider the myths again, but this time, not as vague poetic allegories. Consider them as historical records filtered through oral tradition. When the Sumerians described Dilmun as a paradise, where the croak of the raven was not heard, where the lion did not kill, where the wolf did not carry off the lamb. They're not describing heaven. They're describing an ecological state, a place with different fauna, perhaps an island or isolated plain. When they say it was across the water, they're giving us a location. Not Mesopotamia itself, but somewhere else, somewhere accessible by boat. When Plato describes Atlantis, his details are oddly specific. A large island, agriculturally rich, with advanced engineering, sophisticated governance, and naval power. He places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, implying the Atlantic. Most scholars dismiss it as allegory. But what if Plato was repeating a much older account, one that had reached the Greeks through Egyptian priests, who themselves had inherited it from earlier sources? What if the name Atlantis is simply the Greek rendering of a memory filtered through languages and centuries? The Hindu texts describe Kumari Kandam, a vast land south of India, drowned by the ocean in stages. Tamil literature speaks of 3 ancient sangams, assemblies of poets and scholars, lost when the sea rose. Modern bathymetry shows that the Indian Ocean shelf did extend much farther during the Ice Age. The Maldives, Sri Lanka, and southern India were all part of a much larger landmass. When that flooded, where did the people go? Inland, north, up the river valleys into what became the Indus and Ganges civilizations. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators carry stories of Hawaii, a mythical homeland from which their ancestors voyaged. The details vary by island, but the theme is consistent. A place of origin, now lost or unreachable. Given that sea levels rose dramatically in the Pacific as well, submerging countless islands and coastal areas, these stories take on a different weight. They're not fantasy. They're navigation records, genealogies, maps encoded in chant. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions speak of times when the coastline was different, when you could walk to places that are now islands, when the sea came in and covered the land. Western scientists dismissed these as myth until geologists confirmed that, yes, Aboriginal Australians have been on the continent for at least 65,000 years, and yes, their stories accurately describe landscapes drowned 10,000 years ago. They remembered. For 600 generations, they remembered. If they remembered, who else did? Now let's talk about migration patterns. When we map the spread of early agricultural societies using archaeology and genetics, a curious picture emerges. These societies don't spread evenly in all directions. They spread inland, upriver into highland regions. They move away from coastlines, as if fleeing something. And the direction they move suggests a point of origin not in the river valleys themselves, but further out, toward the coast or beyond it. Take the Fertile Crescent. Conventional history places the origin of agriculture in the inland hills of the Levant and Anatolia, where wild grains naturally grew. But genetic studies of domesticated wheat, barley, and pulses show that the diversity is highest not in the highlands, but in regions that would have been coastal plains during the Ice Age, regions now underwater. If domestication began in those drowned lowlands, then the seeds and knowledge moved inland with the refugees. The same pattern appears in Southeast Asia. Early rice cultivation shows up in river valleys, but the genetic diversity of rice suggests an origin point further south, in what is now the submerged Sunda Shelf. The languages of the region, too, hint at a common root somewhere out in the vanished plains. And in the Americas, the story repeats. Coastal migration routes along both the Pacific and Atlantic seaboards show movement inland over time, populations pressing up river systems, establishing centers far from the coasts. Why? If coastal resources were so rich and they were, why leave? Unless the coast itself was disappearing. Every time we dig deeper, every time we look closer at the genetic record, the linguistic connections, the mythological concordance, the same image forms. A world where the earliest humans weren't scattered primitives stumbling toward civilization independently, but survivors of an older, drowned world, carrying forward what they could. And the question we keep avoiding is this. If that world was sophisticated enough to leave such deep cultural imprints, to teach agriculture, to inspire myth, to send its refugees across the globe with knowledge intact, what did it look like? What did they build? What did they know? We can't answer that yet, because the evidence is underwater, buried under silt, corroded by salt, pressed into the seabed by the weight of 10,000 years. but we can infer. We can extrapolate from what the daughter cultures achieved. The Sumerians wrote in cuneiform, a complex script implying a long history of linguistic development. They built ziggurats with precise geometric ratios. They used a base 60-number system, still present in our measurement of time and angles, a system so abstract, so mathematically sophisticated, it seems unlikely to have been invented from scratch by a people only recently settled. More likely, they inherited it. The Egyptians raised the pyramids using construction techniques we still don't fully understand. They aligned their monuments to celestial phenomena with staggering precision. They mummified bodies with chemical processes that required advanced empirical knowledge. And their earliest texts, the pyramid texts, don't describe the invention of this knowledge. They describe its preservation, its transmission from the first time, a primordial era when the gods or the ancestors walked the earth. The Harappans built cities with grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, and advanced drainage systems. Their script remains undeciphered, but the mere existence of a script implies administrative complexity, trade networks, historical record-keeping, all hallmarks of a mature civilization. And they appeared suddenly, fully formed, around 2600 BCE, with no clear predecessor in the region. Do you see the pattern? They don't fumble. They don't experiment clumsily. They begin with competence, as if they're not inventing, but remembering. Now consider the engineering required to live on a low-lying coastal plain threatened by rising water. You'd need hydraulic knowledge, an understanding of tides, drainage, flood control. You'd need to build on pilings or earth mounds or artificial islands. You'd need boats, sophisticated navigation, trade by sea. You'd develop astronomy to navigate by stars. You'd track lunar cycles for tidal prediction. You'd become expert in working with water, not against it. And when the water finally forced you to leave, what would you carry inland? All of that knowledge, the mathematics of flood cycles, the architecture of water management, the astronomical observations, the boat building, the stories. So where was it? Where was this place that no longer exists, this hypothetical homeland from which civilization supposedly radiated? The honest answer is we don't know. Not with certainty, but we can narrow it down. We can look at where the major early civilizations arose and trace the vectors backward. We can examine which submerged plains would have been most habitable, most conducive to early development. We can cross-reference mythological clues with geological evidence. And when we do, certain regions emerge as candidates. The first is Sundaland. During the Ice Age, the South China Sea was largely dry. The Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, all connected into a single massive landmass roughly the size of India, crisscrossed by rivers, covered in rainforest and savanna, teeming with life. This was one of the most biodiverse, resource-rich regions on the planet. If early humans gathered anywhere in large numbers, it would have been here. And they did. Genetic evidence shows that modern human populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania carry deep ancestral roots, stretching back 50 to 60,000 years. These weren't wandering nomads. They were established, long-term residents. And when Sundaland flooded, incrementally but inexorably between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, those populations had to go somewhere. Some moved north into what is now southern China. Some moved west into mainland Southeast Asia. Some took to boats and became the seafaring ancestors of the Pacific Islanders. And perhaps some carried with them the memory of a great land lost to water, a memory that became Kumari Kandam, Hawaii, Mu, Lemuria, names that shift with the telling but always point to the same theme, a vanished paradise in the southern seas. The second candidate is the Persian Gulf. 15,000 years ago, it wasn't a gulf. It was a river valley, lush and fertile, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and other rivers converging into a single waterway that flowed south into the Indian Ocean. Geological surveys of the Gulf floor show ancient river channels, deltaic formations, and sediment layers indicating a landscape once exposed to air. This valley would have been ideal for early settlement. Abundant water, rich soil, access to diverse ecosystems, riverine, coastal, desert fringe. and it lies directly adjacent to Mesopotamia, the land of Sumer. When the Gulf flooded, rising seawater would have pushed populations inland, up the river valleys, into the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Is it coincidence that the Sumerians placed their mythical paradise, Dilmun, across the water to the southeast, exactly where the drowned valley lies? Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that the biblical Garden of Eden, described as being watered by 4 rivers, is a distorted memory of this same region. The 4 rivers of Eden, Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates, may correspond to waterways that once flowed through the Gulf Valley before it drowned. If so, then Eden isn't a metaphor, it's a place, and it's underwater. The third candidate is the Azores Plateau and the surrounding Atlantic ridges. This is the most controversial because it directly invokes Atlantis. But strip away the embellishments, the mysticism, the theosophy, and consider the geology. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a volcanic mountain range running down the center of the ocean. In places, it rises close to the surface. The Azores are the peaks of these underwater mountains, the only parts still above water. But during the Ice Age, with sea levels lower, more of this ridge would have been exposed. Could a landmass large enough to support a civilization have existed here? The geology is contentious. Most scientists say no, that the ridge was never a continuous landmass, only isolated volcanic islands. But bathymetry does show anomalous plateaus, flat regions that suggest erosion by weather and waves, erosion that only happens above water. And if even a portion of the ridge was exposed and habitable, it would have been positioned perfectly to influence both the Mediterranean and the Americas, acting as a cultural bridge. The timing fits. Around 9600 BCE, the exact date Plato gives for the sinking of Atlantis. A massive pulse of melt caused global sea levels to rise rapidly, an event called Meltwater Pulse 1b. Coastal regions everywhere would have flooded. If something existed on the Atlantic ridges, it would have been inundated then. But here's the difficulty: proving it. The Atlantic is deep, turbulent, and less explored than any other ocean. Even if structures exist, they'd be under miles of water, covered in volcanic sediment, battered by millennia of currents. Finding them would require resources, funding, and political will that simply don't exist for what most consider a fringe theory. So we're left with inference, myth, bathymetry, and the nagging sense that we're missing something. There are other candidates too. Doggerland in the North Sea, the continental shelf off West Africa, the submerged extensions of the Sahara, which was once green and fertile, the drowned coasts of the Americas, both Pacific and Atlantic, Zealandia, the submerged continent east of Australia, Beringia, the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. Each of these regions has its champions, its researchers pointing to geological features or mythological correlations. And each time someone looks closely, they find something that doesn't quite fit the standard narrative. Stone tools in unexpected layers. Pollen samples indicating agriculture far earlier than expected. Genetic markers suggesting population movements that predate known migrations. The problem is that we've been looking in the wrong places. We've been excavating river valleys and highlands because that's where the civilizations we know existed. But what if those were always secondary sites? What if the primary centers, the true origin points, were always on the coasts, in the lowlands, in the places that are now gone? Imagine a civilization that built primarily with wood, with reeds, with organic materials that decompose. No stone temples to survive the millennia. No metal artifacts to resist corrosion. Just knowledge. Astronomy, navigation, agriculture, language, myth. And when the floods came, the people moved, but the cities stayed behind, dissolving into silt, leaving only faint traces that we've never thought to look for because we didn't believe they could exist. This is the irony. We've assumed that civilization is stone, that only monumental architecture counts as evidence. But what if the first civilizations were lighter, more adaptive, more attuned to their environment? What if they didn't need pyramids because they had the stars, didn't need writing because they had memory, didn't need walls because they had water? And when they moved inland, forced by the rising seas, they adapted their knowledge to new environments. They built in stone because wood was scarce. They wrote on clay because memory alone was no longer enough to preserve what they knew across fracturing populations. They built monuments because they needed markers, anchors, ways to say, "We were here, we survived, we remember." The megaliths scattered across the world, Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, Karnak, the stone circles of Africa, the platforms of the Pacific, perhaps these weren't primitive attempts at architecture. Perhaps they were commemorations. Celestial observatories, yes, but also memorials. Markers of a lineage, a connection to something older, something lost. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, remains one of the most baffling sites in archaeology. It predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates everything we thought necessary for monumental construction. Yet there it stands. Massive stone pillars carved with intricate reliefs, arranged in circular complexes, built by people who supposedly lived as hunter-gatherers. Unless they weren't hunter-gatherers. Unless they were refugees, survivors of the flood epoch, carrying knowledge from the drowned coasts, building in the highlands because the lowlands were gone. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe depict animals, abstract symbols, and strange humanoid figures. One pillar shows a scene interpreted by some as a comet impact. Another shows what might be constellations. They're not decorative. They're informational. They're trying to tell us something. Let's talk about the flood itself. Not as myth, but as memory. Because the more we study it, the more we realize that nearly every culture on Earth has a flood story. Not similar stories, nearly identical ones. A great deluge, divine anger or cosmic catastrophe. A few survivors in a boat. The waters recede. Humanity begins again. The Sumerians have the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim is warned of the coming flood and builds a boat to save his family and animals. The Hebrews have Noah and the Ark. The Greeks have Deucalion and Pyrrha. The Hindus describe Manu, saved by a fish that pulls his boat to safety. The Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians all tell versions of the same event. But it's not just the Middle East. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest tell of a great flood that covered the mountains. The Hopi of North America speak of emerging from a lower world into this one after a flood destroyed the previous one. In South America, the Inca and pre-Inca cultures describe a Pachacuti, a world-overturning flood sent by the gods. In Africa, the Yoruba recount a deluge from which only a handful escaped. In Australia, Aboriginal stories tell of the sea rising and swallowing the land. These aren't borrowings. These cultures were separated by oceans, by millennia. They had no contact, yet they all remembered a flood. Why? Because it happened. Not as a single global inundation in 40 days and nights, but as a long, relentless process spanning thousands of years. Pulses of melt from glacial collapse. Rivers overflowing. Coastlines retreating. Plains drowning. For people living in those vulnerable regions, it would have felt apocalyptic. And over generations, the trauma embedded itself into story. The details shifted, filtered through language and religion, but the core remained. The water came, the world changed, and we survived. Modern geology confirms it. At the end of the Pleistocene, global sea levels rose by approximately 400 feet. Not steadily, but in surges. Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,000 years ago, raised sea levels by 50 to 80 feet in just a few centuries. Meltwater Pulse 1B, around 11,000 years ago, added another 30 feet. And there were smaller pulses throughout, each one catastrophic for coastal populations. Imagine watching the sea advance. Not inch by inch, but yard by yard, year by year. You move your village back, then back again. You lose your fishing grounds, your shellfish beds, your tidal gardens. Your ancestors' graves disappear beneath the waves. The places where you were born no longer exist. And you can't stop it. You can only retreat. At some point, retreat becomes exodus. You gather what you can, seeds, tools, stories, and you leave. You follow the rivers inland. You search for new land, new resources. You carry your knowledge, but you've lost your context. The boats that once navigated shallow seas are now useless in mountainous terrain. The tidal calendars no longer apply. You adapt or you die. And in the process, something is lost. Not everything, but enough. Enough that your descendants, 1,000 years later, no longer remember exactly where they came from. They remember the flood. They remember the crossing. They remember that their ancestors came from somewhere else, somewhere great, somewhere lost. And they call it Eden, Dilmun, Atlantis, Hawaii, the first time, paradise. But here's the unsettling part. What if the flood wasn't the only catastrophe? What if it coincided with something else? Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate changed abruptly. The planet had been warming steadily out of the Ice Age, but suddenly, it plunged back into cold. Temperatures dropped. Glaciers re-advanced. This period, called the Younger Dryas, lasted for more than 1,000 years before warming resumed. The cause is debated. Some scientists point to a disruption in ocean currents caused by meltwater flooding the North Atlantic, shutting down the Gulf Stream. Others suggest volcanic eruptions. But a growing body of evidence points to an extraterrestrial impact. One or more comet fragments striking the ice sheets or exploding in the atmosphere, triggering wildfires, climate disruption, and mass extinction. Geological layers from this period show a spike in platinum, nanodiamonds, and spherules, microscopic particles associated with high-energy impacts. Burn layers suggest widespread fires. Megafauna extinctions accelerate. And human populations, which had been growing, suddenly contract. If an impact occurred, and if it struck the ice sheets over North America or Eurasia, the immediate result would have been catastrophic melting. Not gradual, sudden. Enormous floods of meltwater pouring into the oceans, raising sea levels in a matter of decades or even years. Low-lying regions would have been swallowed almost instantly. This isn't fringe anymore. It's increasingly mainstream. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has its critics, but the evidence keeps mounting. And if it's true, then the flood stories aren't just about slow sea level rise. They're about cataclysm, apocalypse, a world that ended not in centuries, but in seasons. Imagine surviving that. Imagine watching the sky burn, the ice collapse, the sea surge inland faster than you can run. Imagine entire populations erased in weeks. And imagine the survivors, traumatized, dislocated, trying to make sense of what happened. They would tell their children, and their children would tell theirs. And down through the generations, the story would travel, hardening into myth, but never entirely losing the truth. Now think about what such an event would do to a coastal civilization. Even a sophisticated one. If your cities were built on river deltas, on flat plains near the sea, they would be gone. Utterly. Nothing would remain except what people carried away in boats, in their minds, in their hands. And if the survivors scattered, if they fled in different directions, then the knowledge would fragment. Each group would retain pieces, but none would have the whole. This is why the early post-flood civilizations seem to have inherited knowledge they didn't develop themselves. Because they didn't. They received it. From refugees. From survivors. From the people who came before. The Sumerians didn't invent cuneiform from scratch. They refined it, systematized it, but the concept of writing, encoding language and symbols was already there. Someone taught them. Or they remembered. The Egyptians didn't figure out pyramid construction by trial and error. The earliest pyramids aren't crude. They're experimental, yes, but informed by geometric principles that imply prior understanding. The megaliths of Europe weren't built by primitives. They were built by people who knew stone, who knew astronomy, who knew math. And all of them were built in the shadow of the flood. Look at Göbekli Tepe again. Built around 9,600 BCE, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, right when the climate stabilized and the final meltwater pulses occurred. It's on a hilltop, deliberately chosen for visibility and perhaps safety from floods. It required coordination, labor, planning, hallmarks of social organization. But there's no evidence of permanent settlement. No houses. No trash heaps. Just the temple complex. What if it wasn't a settlement at all? What if it was a project? A monument built by people who had lost their homeland and wanted to preserve something. Knowledge, memory, identity. They carved their symbols into stone because stone lasts. Because clay washes away, wood rots, memory fades. But stone endures. And then they left. or they died, or they integrated into other populations, and the site was buried, deliberately, carefully, preserved under tons of earth until we found it 11,000 years later and realized we had no idea who built it or why. There's another piece to this. Language. Because if a common civilization dispersed across the world, it should have left linguistic traces. And it has. Maybe. Linguists have long theorized about a proto-world language, a hypothetical single ancestral tongue from which all modern languages descend. Most consider it impossible to reconstruct. Too much time has passed, too much divergence. But certain words, certain sounds, appear in unrelated language families across the globe with suspiciously similar meanings. The word for water, for instance. In many Indo-European languages, it's related to aqua, water, wasser. In Sumerian, it's a. In Proto-Dravidian, near. In some indigenous American languages, ama or aim. Coincidence? Or echo? The word for mother tends toward ma, sounds across dozens of unrelated languages. Father often uses pa or ta. These are attributed to baby sounds, universal vocalizations. But what if they're also remnants? What if a parent language used these roots, and they survived the fragmentation? There's a more radical idea. Some linguists and archaeologists have suggested that certain symbols, simple geometric shapes, appear repeatedly in prehistoric art across continents. Circles, spirals, zigzags, concentric rings, dots, lines. These aren't random doodles. They're consistent, repeated, as if they mean something. In the caves of Europe, carved into rock in Australia, painted on pottery in the Americas, scratched into bone in Africa, these symbols recur. Standard archaeology treats them as independent inventions, universal human expressions of pattern recognition. But what if they're older? What if they're inherited? What if they're fragments of a symbolic system developed by a pre-flood culture and carried forward by the survivors? We can't prove it. The evidence is too fragmentary, too open to interpretation. But the possibility nags. Because if you wanted to preserve knowledge through an apocalypse, what would you do? You'd simplify. You'd reduce complex ideas to essential symbols. You'd teach them to your children. You'd carve them everywhere you could. And you'd hope that someday, someone would remember what they meant. Now let's turn to technology. Not in the sense of machines, but in the sense of practical knowledge. The skills that allowed early civilizations to thrive. Agriculture. We're told it was invented independently in multiple regions. The Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa. But when we look at the genetics of domesticated plants, strange patterns emerge. The diversity of wheat suggests a single origin point, then dispersal. Rice shows a similar pattern. Maize, potatoes, squash, each seems to have one primary domestication event, followed by spread and adaptation. If agriculture was invented multiple times, we'd expect multiple, distinct domestication events. Instead, we see single events with rapid spread, as if someone already knew how to do it and taught others, or as if people fleeing a common origin brought seeds and knowledge with them. The same applies to animal domestication. Dogs, domesticated from wolves, show genetic evidence of a single domestication event, possibly as far back as 30,000 years ago. Cattle, goats, sheep all show similar patterns. Someone figured it out once and the knowledge spread. Then there's navigation. The Polynesians colonized the Pacific using star navigation, reading waves, following birds. They reached islands thousands of miles apart with no written maps, no compasses. How? They inherited the knowledge. Their ancestors were seafarers, possibly displaced by rising seas, who retained the skills of ocean travel. When they spread across the Pacific, they carried those skills forward, refining them over generations. The same is true of astronomy. Ancient cultures across the world tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision. Stonehenge aligns with solstices. The pyramids align with Orion. Mayan temples encode astronomical cycles. The Nabta Playa stone circle in Egypt, dated to around 5000 BCE, tracks stars. Göbekli Tepe has carvings that some interpret as constellations. Why were they all so obsessed with the sky? Because navigation by stars was essential to survival. If you lived on coastal plains, traveled by boat, migrated across open water, you needed the stars. And when you moved inland, you kept watching them, because they were your connection to the lost world, your map of time, your proof that the cosmos was ordered and knowable. There's something profoundly moving about that. A people who lost their land but kept the sky. Who couldn't return home but could still point to the same stars their ancestors watched and say, "We remember." So where does this leave us? With more questions than answers, but also with a sense that history is deeper than we've been taught. That the neat timeline of civilization, from primitive to advanced, from stone tools to cities, is a simplification. That humanity's story is older, stranger, more layered. What if civilization didn't begin 5,000 years ago in Sumer? What if it began 15,000 years ago, or 20,000, or more, in places we've never looked because they no longer exist? What if the people we call the first were actually the survivors? What if every pyramid, every megalith, every temple and text is an act of remembrance, an attempt to rebuild, to restore, to pass forward something that was nearly lost? And what if, in our own time, we're finally developing the tools to look beneath the waves and see what's there? Sonar that can map the seabed in detail. Submersibles that can explore depths we once thought unreachable. Artificial intelligence that can recognize patterns in stone, in sediment, in ancient symbols we've never understood. We are on the verge. Whether we realize it or not, we are about to answer questions we've been asking for millennia. Who were we? Where did we come from? What did we lose? But the answers won't come easily. The ocean guards its secrets. Sediment buries the past. Currents erode. Pressure crushes. And the deeper we go, the stranger the questions become. Because if we find something, if we find ruins, artifacts, evidence of a sophisticated pre-flood culture, we'll have to reckon with what that means. We'll have to rewrite history, rewrite anthropology, rethink what we thought we knew about human development, human capacity, human memory. And we'll have to ask, what else did they know? What else have we forgotten? Consider this: modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Civilization, as we define it, has existed for 5,000. That leaves 295,000 years unaccounted for. We assume those were spent in small bands, hunting and gathering, slowly evolving language and culture. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there were rises and falls we never recorded? Cultures that flourished and vanished, leaving no trace but myth? The earth is old. Humans are adaptable. Ice ages come and go. Sea levels rise and fall. What's built can be destroyed. What's known can be forgotten. And what's lost can sometimes, against all odds, be remembered. We need to talk about Sundaland again because of all the drowned lands, it's the most compelling. And the most tragic. Imagine the scene. A vast, tropical landmass stretching from the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, from Sumatra to Java. Rivers carve through it, massive and slow, draining into the South China Sea, which at that time was mostly dry. The climate is warm, wet, rich. Rainforests thrive. Savannas spread along the river valleys. The coasts teem with marine life. Resources are abundant, and people live there, not in small, scattered bands, but in populations that number in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, spread across the plains. They fish. They cultivate root crops. They weave. They build shelters on stilts to avoid flooding during monsoons. They develop trade routes along rivers and coasts. They watch the stars to predict seasons. They create art, music, language. They tell stories. And then the ice begins to melt. Slowly at first. The coastlines shift slightly. They adapt. But over centuries, the water keeps coming. The plains begin to shrink. River valleys flood permanently. Islands form where there were once hills. The population is forced to consolidate, to move inward, to compete for shrinking land. By 7,000 years ago, most of Sundaland is gone. What remains is the fragmented archipelago we know today: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. But the people don't disappear. They move. Some go north into mainland Southeast Asia, into China. Some go west into the Indian subcontinent. Some take to boats and venture east, becoming the ancestors of the Pacific Islanders. And each group carries something with them: languages, technologies, myths, genetic markers, cultural practices. When linguists analyze the Austronesian language family, spoken across the Pacific from Madagascar to Easter Island, they trace it back to a single origin point, Taiwan. But where did it come from before that? Genetic studies suggest a deeper origin further south, in a region that no longer exists, Sundaland. The same is true of rice cultivation. The domestication of rice is traditionally placed in the Yangtze River Valley in China. But genetic analysis of wild and domesticated rice varieties shows the greatest diversity in regions that once bordered the Sunda Shelf. If rice was first cultivated there, then knowledge of its cultivation moved north with the refugees. And then there are the tools. Across islands Southeast Asia, archaeologists find a specific type of stone tool called the Hoabinian tradition, dated between 40,000 and 2,000 years ago. These tools are simple but effective, adapted to a rainforest environment. They appear across a wide area: Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. The standard explanation is that they represent a shared cultural adaptation. But the distribution makes more sense if the culture developed on Sundaland, then fragmented as the land flooded and populations dispersed. Even more intriguing are the underwater finds. Fishermen in the Java Sea have reported bringing up stone tools, pottery shards, and fossilized remains from their nets. Divers exploring underwater caves off the coast of Thailand have found human remains dated to over 20,000 years ago, at depths now submerged. These aren't relics of people who died at sea. They're evidence of people who lived on land that is now underwater. But large-scale underwater archaeology in this region is nearly non-existent. The waters are murky, the currents strong, the legal and political complications immense. Governments have more pressing priorities than funding speculative searches for submerged ruins. So the evidence sits there, beneath the waves, untouched. And the question remains, what are we missing? Sundaland wasn't just a land bridge. It was an ecological and cultural heartland. If a sophisticated culture developed there, one with navigation, agriculture, language, art, it would have been positioned to influence the entire surrounding world. To the north, China. To the west, India. To the east, the Pacific. It was a hub. And when it drowned, the ripples spread across the world. Now contrast that with the other candidate, the Persian Gulf. The valley that once existed there was smaller than Sundaland, but strategically positioned. It sat at the crossroads of three continents: Asia, Africa, Europe. Rivers flowed into it from Mesopotamia, from Persia, from Arabia. It was fertile, protected, easily navigable. If a culture developed there, it would have had access to diverse resources: copper from the mountains, obsidian from Anatolia, fish from the sea, grains from the foothills. And when the Gulf flooded, the survivors wouldn't have had far to go. They'd simply move upriver, into the plains of Mesopotamia, carrying their knowledge with them. This might explain the sudden appearance of the Sumerians. They claim they came from the sea, from Dilmun. If Dilmun was the drowned Gulf Valley, then the Sumerians weren't indigenous to Mesopotamia. They were refugees, inheritors of an older culture, and their myths of gods descending from heaven, of knowledge given by divine figures. Maybe those weren't myths. Maybe they were distorted memories of teachers, of ancestors, of people who came before and passed their knowledge forward. The Sumerian king list, a document cataloging rulers of ancient Sumer, begins with kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Historians dismiss these as mythological. But what if they represent dynasties, genealogies compressed into single names? What if the time before the flood in Sumerian memory refers to the Gulf Valley, and the kings listed are echoes of tribal leaders, cultural heroes, ancestors who lived on the now-drowned plain? We'll never know for certain unless we excavate the Gulf floor. And that's a monumental task. The Gulf is shallow but vast, covered in sediment, heavy with oil infrastructure. But the potential is there. Beneath the silt there might be ruins, foundations, artifacts, proof, or there might be nothing. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's also not evidence of presence. And that's the trap we find ourselves in. We can hypothesize. We can correlate myths with geology. We can trace genetic and linguistic patterns. But until we put shovels, or rather submersibles, into the ground, we're speculating. Still, speculation has its place. It drives inquiry. It asks the questions that lead to discovery. And the question we're asking now is profound. What if the story of human civilization is backwards? What if we've been looking at the endpoint, the river valleys, the highlands, the monumental cultures, and mistaking them for the beginning? Let's talk about memory itself. Because what we're really discussing is the persistence of knowledge across time, through disaster beyond collapse. How does a culture remember when everything physical is lost? The answer is orally, through story, through song, through ritual. We underestimate oral tradition. In a literate world, where everything is written, recorded, backed up, we assume that memory is fallible, that stories degrade, that information is lost. But that's not how oral cultures worked. They didn't just casually tell stories. They trained memorizers. They embedded knowledge in rhythm, in repetition, in chant. They used mnemonic devices, formulas, patterns that made information sticky, resistant to change. Studies of contemporary oral cultures, Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, African griots, show that oral transmission can be remarkably accurate over hundreds of generations. Stories about specific places, events, and people can remain consistent for thousands of years. The Aboriginal stories about drowned coastlines, for instance, have been verified by geology. They remembered. For 10,000 years, they remembered. So if a pre-flood culture was destroyed, but its people survived, they could carry their knowledge forward. Not in books, not in archives, in their minds, in their words, in the stories they told their children. And as those children spread across the world, the stories spread with them. Details changed. Names shifted. The context was lost. But the core remained. There was a land, there was a flood, there was a time before. This is why flood myths are universal. Not because one culture borrowed from another, but because they all descended from survivors of the same event. The flood wasn't metaphor. It was history. And every culture that survived encoded the memory differently, filtered through their own landscape, language, and cosmology. In Mesopotamia, it became the epic of Gilgamesh. In Israel, Noah's Ark. In Greece, Deucalion. In India, Manu. In the Americas, countless deluge tales. Each different, each the same. And embedded within these stories are other details, fragments of knowledge. The gods who came before. The teachers who gave knowledge. The ancestors who were different. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens and taught humanity. The Egyptians described the Neteru, divine beings who ruled during the first time. The Mayans told of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who brought civilization. The Dogon of Mali speak of the Namo, beings from the sky who taught them astronomy. The Hopi recall the ant people who sheltered them during cataclysms. Standard interpretation. These are myths, personifications of natural forces, or distorted memories of tribal leaders. But what if there's something else? What if they're memories of people, just people, not gods, who came from somewhere else, who possessed knowledge that seemed miraculous to those who received it? Imagine you're a survivor. You fled the flood with your family. You know agriculture. You know the stars. You know mathematics. You settle among inland tribes who are still hunter-gatherers. To them, you seem almost magical. You predict the seasons. You can navigate by the stars. You can cultivate food where none grew before. And you teach them. Over generations, you become legend. Your knowledge becomes divine gift. Your origins become celestial. This is how myths form. Not from fabrication, but from distortion of memory over time. The teacher becomes the god. The homeland becomes heaven. The flood becomes divine punishment. But the core is real. There's another aspect to this. The idea of cyclical time. Many ancient cultures, Hindu, Mayan, Greek, Norse, didn't see time as linear. They saw it as cyclical. Ages rose and fell. Worlds were created and destroyed. Humanity lived, died, and was reborn. We moderns dismiss this as mysticism. But what if it's observation? What if they witnessed the cycle? Watched civilizations collapse, saw knowledge lost, then slowly, painfully rebuilt? And what if they encoded this understanding into their cosmologies, not as poetry, but as warning? The Hindu concept of yugas, vast ages of time, each degenerating from a golden age to a dark age before renewal, might not be metaphysical. It might be historical, a memory of cycles of rise and fall, written large. The Mayan calendar, which measures vast cycles of time culminating in periods of transformation, might be an inherited system, refined over millennia, meant to track not just years but epochs. The Greek ages, gold, silver, bronze, iron, might be a compressed history of human development, each age representing a stage in the recovery from cataclysm. We've trained ourselves to see history as progressive, from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge. But what if it's not? What if it's cyclical? What if we rise, fall, and rise again, each time losing a little, relearning a little, never quite reaching the heights of the previous cycle because something essential is always lost? This is a deeply unsettling thought, because it implies that we, too, could fall. That our technology, our knowledge, our civilization, none of it is guaranteed. That we're not the pinnacle but a point on a wheel. And maybe that's why the ancients built so obsessively. Why they carved into stone, erected megaliths, buried time capsules in myth. They were trying to preserve something. Trying to ensure that, if they fell, the next cycle would have a head start. But what were they trying to preserve? What knowledge was so essential that it had to be encoded into monument, myth, and mathematics? Astronomy, certainly. The stars are eternal, unchanging on human timescales. If you want to preserve knowledge across collapse, tie it to the sky. Teach the constellations. Encode the cycles. Build structures that align with celestial events. That way, even if language is lost, even if writing disappears, future generations can look up and rediscover. Agriculture, obviously, the knowledge of which plants to cultivate, when to plant, how to store seeds. This is life or death, and it's fragile. A single generation that fails to pass it on, and the knowledge is gone. Mathematics, base 60 in Sumer, base 20 in Mesoamerica, the golden ratio in Egypt and Greece. These aren't arbitrary. They're functional, useful, beautiful. They describe the world. And once discovered, they must be preserved. But maybe something else too. Something subtler. A worldview. A philosophy. An understanding that humanity is part of a larger whole, connected to the earth, the sky, the cosmos. That we're not separate from nature, but embedded in it. That our actions have consequences across time. That we're stewards, not masters. This is the knowledge we've lost. And it's the knowledge we desperately need to rediscover. Now we come to the hardest question. Why does this matter? Why does it matter if there was a civilization before the ones we know? Why does it matter if Sundaland or the Persian Gulf or Atlantis existed? Because it changes who we are. If human civilization is only 5,000 years old, then we're young. We're still learning. Our mistakes, environmental destruction, war, inequality, can be excused as growing pains. We'll get better. We're progressing. But if civilization is 15,000 years old or older, and we've already been through cycles of rise and fall, then we're not young. We're amnesiac. We've forgotten. We've lost knowledge we once had. And we're repeating mistakes we've already made. That's a different story. A darker one. But also, perhaps, a wiser one. Because if we've fallen before, we can fall again. And knowing that, we might choose differently. This is why the myth of Atlantis endures. Not because people believe in a literal sunken island with crystal technology and flying machines, but because it represents a warning. A great civilization, advanced and powerful, destroyed by its own hubris. It's a parable. But what if it's also history? What if the drowned lands weren't just passive victims of rising seas, but active participants in their own destruction? What if they grew too large, too dependent on specific resources, too centralized? What if climate change, even natural climate change, exposed the fragility of their systems, and they couldn't adapt quickly enough? We're facing the same challenges now. Rising seas, climate instability, resource depletion, overpopulation, interconnected global systems that are efficient but fragile. If any one piece fails, the whole structure could collapse. And if it does, what will survive? What will future generations remember of us? Maybe they'll find our cities, flooded and ruined, and wonder who we were. Maybe they'll excavate our data centers, corroded and useless, and try to piece together our knowledge. Maybe they'll read our myths, our movies, our books, our internet archives, and think we were gods or fools. Or maybe they won't find anything at all. Maybe the ocean will swallow the coasts where most of our cities stand. Maybe the sediment will cover everything. And in 10,000 years, someone will tell a story about a great civilization that fell, and no one will believe them. Unless we choose differently, unless we learn from the past, the real past, the hidden past, the drowned past. This is why archaeology matters. Why we need to look beneath the waves. Not for treasure, not for glory, but for knowledge, for warning, for connection to those who came before, who faced what we're facing, who tried and perhaps failed, but who left us clues. And the clues are there, in the myths, in the genes, in the submerged plateaus mapped by sonar, in the flood stories told by every culture, in the megaliths that point to the stars, in the languages that share unexpected roots, in the crops that were domesticated once, not many times, in the knowledge that appeared too suddenly, too complete to be wholly new. We've been taught to see history as a straight line, primitive to civilized, ignorant to enlightened. But the evidence suggests something messier. A web, a spiral, a cycle, rises and falls, knowledge gained and lost and remembered, civilizations that flourished in places we've never looked, whose legacies we carry without knowing. And if that's true, then the question isn't just, who were they? It's who are we? Are we the descendants of survivors, carrying forward a fractured inheritance, trying to piece together what was lost? Are we rememberers, slowly rediscovering knowledge that was never truly new? Are we, in some deep sense, still living in the shadow of the flood, still recovering, still rebuilding? Look at the world today. We split the atom. We map the genome. We send machines to Mars. We've built a global network of information accessible to billions. We've achieved things that would seem like magic to our ancestors. But we've also lost things. Connection to the natural world. Stability of climate. Biodiversity. Languages die every year. Ecosystems collapse. Indigenous knowledge, accumulated over millennia, disappears with every elder who passes without students. We're advancing in some ways, regressing in others, and the line between the two is blurrier than we'd like to admit. What if this is the cycle? What if we're always advancing and regressing simultaneously, gaining and losing, building and forgetting? And what if the key to breaking the cycle, or at least navigating it, is to remember, to look back, not with nostalgia, but with clear eyes, to recognize that we're not the first, that we won't be the last, and that the choices we make now echo forward into a future we can't predict. The drowned lands are a mirror. They show us what happens when the world changes and we can't adapt. When the water rises and there's nowhere to go. When the places we thought were eternal turn out to be temporary. And they also show us resilience, because the people survived. They lost their homeland, but they kept their humanity. They scattered across the world, adapted to new environments, rebuilt their cultures. They didn't give up. They carried forward. And here we are, their descendants, still carrying forward. So maybe the question isn't just, where did we come from? It's where are we going? And what will we carry with us? Because the water is rising again. Not as fast as it did during the melt pulses, but inexorably. Coastal cities are already planning for floods. Low-lying nations are considering relocation. The maps are changing, and we have a choice. We can ignore the past, assume we're immune to its lessons, and hope technology will save us. Or we can remember, learn, adapt. We can look beneath the waves and see not just ruins, but a warning. A reminder that the Earth doesn't care about our civilizations. That the climate will change, the seas will rise, the ice will melt or grow, regardless of what we do. But we care. And we can choose how we respond. We can choose to preserve knowledge, not in fragile digital formats or decaying paper, but in the most enduring ways possible. In education, in culture, in stone if necessary. We can choose to build systems that are resilient, not just efficient. We can choose to remember that we're part of a long, long story, and that our chapter is not the final one. And maybe, if we do that, the next cycle, if there is one, won't have to start from scratch. Maybe they'll look back at us and see not just ruins, but a bridge, a handoff, a gift of knowledge, carefully preserved, waiting to be rediscovered. Just like the ancients tried to do for us. There's one more place we need to talk about. One more drowned land that haunts the edges of history and myth, more controversial than any of the others, more disputed, more laden with pseudoscience and wishful thinking, and yet, stubbornly, persistently refusing to disappear. Atlantis. The word itself has become synonymous with lost civilizations. It's been invoked by mystics, charlatans, and fantasists. It's been placed everywhere from the Caribbean to Antarctica to outer space. It's been so thoroughly mythologized that serious scholars won't touch it, dismissing it as Plato's invention, a philosophical allegory with no historical basis. But what if Plato was repeating something older? What if his account, recorded in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, preserves a genuine memory, filtered through centuries and translations, but rooted in something real? Here's what Plato says. Atlantis was a large island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. It was home to a powerful civilization, advanced in engineering and governance, with a formidable navy. It conquered parts of Europe and Africa before being repelled by ancient Athens. Then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, earthquake and flood, it sank beneath the waves and disappeared. The date he gives, passed down from Egyptian priests to the Greek lawmaker Solon to Plato, 9,000 years before Solon's time. That places the event around 9,600 BCE, the exact end of the Younger Dryas, the exact time of the final melt pulses. Coincidence? Mainstream archaeology says yes. There's no physical evidence of a large island civilization in the Atlantic at that time. The geology doesn't support it. The Atlantic seafloor is spreading, volcanic, not sinking continental crust. And even if something existed, the ocean there is miles deep. We'll never find it. But let's not dismiss it so quickly. Let's break down what Plato actually describes and see if any of it fits the drowned lands we've been discussing. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules could mean the Atlantic, could also mean far away, beyond the known world of the Greeks. If the story came to Egypt from Mesopotamia, and from Mesopotamia further east, beyond the Pillars might be poetic distance, not geographic precision. A large island could be literal, could also be a translation issue. The Greek word nisos can mean island, but also peninsula or coastal region. Sundaland was a massive coastal landmass. The Persian Gulf Valley was surrounded by water on three sides. Both could be described as islands in a broad sense. Destroyed in a day and night. Hyperbole for sudden catastrophe. The melt pulses happened over decades or centuries, but to an individual human lifetime, they might seem instantaneous. A single storm surge during a pulse event could wipe out a coastal settlement overnight. Earthquake and flood. Both are consistent with the end of the Younger Dryas. If an impact occurred, it would have caused seismic activity. The resultant melting would have caused floods. So what if Atlantis isn't a single place, but a composite memory? What if the story Plato tells is a distillation of multiple flood events, multiple drowned lands, compressed into one narrative? The Egyptians, who told Solon, had their own flood myths. They described a time before the dynastic period, the Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled. What if their knowledge came from earlier peoples, refugees from drowned coastlines who brought stories with them? The Greeks, who received the story from Solon, also had flood myths. Deucalion's flood mirrors Noah's. The idea of a prior, greater age, the Golden Age, pervades Greek thought. Where did that come from? And Plato himself, writing in the 4th century BCE, was trying to make a philosophical point about hubris and the fragility of civilizations. But to make that point, he chose a story. And stories have origins. What if Atlantis is every drowned land? What if it's the collective memory of Sundaland, the Persian Gulf, Doggerland, the submerged Mediterranean coasts, the Black Sea flood, all woven together into a single myth that preserves the emotional truth? We once lived in a better place, and we lost it. That makes Atlantis not a location, but an idea, a symbol of what we lost when the ice melted and the seas rose. And in that sense, it's more real than any physical ruin could be, because it lives in our collective memory, encoded in myth, passed down through every culture, reminding us that nothing lasts forever. But let's say, for a moment, that there is a physical Atlantis. Where would it be? Not in the deep Atlantic, but perhaps on the mid-Atlantic ridge in shallower waters. The Azores Plateau, as mentioned earlier, is a likely candidate. During the Ice Age, more of the ridge would have been exposed. Not a continent, but perhaps a substantial landmass, volcanic and fertile, capable of supporting a population. If people lived there, they would have been isolated, developing independently. They would have been skilled navigators, able to reach both the Mediterranean and the Americas. And when the seas rose, their land would have been inundated, leaving only the highest peaks, the Azores, above water. Is there evidence? Not conclusive, but there are anomalies. Submarine surveys have found rectilinear formations on the seafloor near the Azores. These could be natural lava flows, fractured along joint lines. Or they could be something else. Core samples from the region have yielded materials that suggest subaerial weathering erosion that happens above water, at depths now far below the surface. And then there are the legends. The indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands, just off the African coast, told of a land to the west now sunk. The Basques, whose language is unrelated to any other in Europe, have myths of a homeland lost to the sea. The Irish speak of Tir na Nog, the land of the young, an island to the west that disappeared. Are these memories of the Atlantic islands now drowned? Or are they, like Atlantis, composite myths? We don't know. But the fact that the question persists, the fact that so many cultures from so many places tell versions of the same story, suggests something. Maybe not a literal Atlantis, but something, a truth at the core. And here's the most important part. It doesn't matter if Atlantis was real. What matters is that the idea of Atlantis forces us to ask better questions. It forces us to look beyond the accepted timeline, to consider what might be lost, to take seriously the possibility that history is older and stranger than we've been taught. Atlantis is a tool, a lens, a way of seeing the world that refuses the simplicity of linear progress and embraces the complexity of cyclical time, forgotten knowledge, and drowned memory. And whether it existed or not, the questions it raises are real. The drowned lands are real. The flood is real. The survivors are real. And we are their descendants. So let's return to the beginning, to the question that started this. What if human civilization began in a place that no longer exists? Not what if in the hypothetical sense, but what if as acceptance, as probability, as the most parsimonious explanation for the patterns we see. Because when we step back, when we look at all the evidence together, not in isolation but as a whole, a picture forms. And it's not the picture we've been given. The picture is this: human beings are older than our civilizations. We've been anatomically modern for 300,000 years. Behaviorally modern for at least 70,000. And for most of that time, we lived on coastlines. We followed rivers. We clustered in the lowlands where resources were abundant and life was easier. During the Ice Age, those lowlands extended far beyond today's coasts. Vast, fertile plains stretched across what are now continental shelves, submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. And on those plains, we thrived. We developed language, culture, technology. We adapted to our environment so thoroughly that we became inseparable from it. And then the ice melted. Slowly at first, then catastrophically. The Younger Dryas impact, or whatever triggered the climate disruption, accelerated the process. Meltwater pulses sent the seas surging. Coastlines retreated miles inland in lifetimes. And the people had no choice but to move. They moved upriver, into the highlands, into marginal lands that were harder, harsher, less forgiving. and they carried with them what they could. Seeds, tools, knowledge, stories. But they lost the context. They lost the cities, if there were cities. They lost the centers, the heartlands. They lost the places where knowledge was concentrated. And so they rebuilt. But not from scratch. From memory. The Sumerians remembered Dilmun. The Egyptians remembered the first time. The Hindus remembered Kumari Kandam. The Greeks remembered Atlantis. The Polynesians remembered Hawaii. The Aboriginals remembered the drowned coasts. They all remembered, because the memory was too important to lose. It was identity. It was history. It was proof that they came from somewhere, that they had been something greater, that they could be again. And they encoded that memory in everything they built. In the ziggurats that echoed the mountains of their lost homeland. In the pyramids that aligned with the stars they navigated by. In the megaliths that marked time and space, anchoring them to the cosmos. In the myths that told of gods and floods and a time before. We've been looking at these cultures as the beginning, but they're not. They're the continuation. And we, in turn, are the continuation of them. Think about what we've achieved in the last century alone. We've gone from horse-drawn carriages to landing on the moon, from telegraph to instant global communication, from slide rules to artificial intelligence. We've decoded the genome. We've photographed black holes. We've built machines that think. But we've also lost languages, ecosystems, stability. We've polluted the oceans, warmed the climate, eroded the soil. We've built systems so complex and interconnected that a single failure can cascade into collapse. We're brilliant and fragile, just like the civilizations before us. And the seas are rising again. Within a century, many of our coastal cities will be threatened. Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, London, New York, Bangkok. Some will build walls. Some will adapt. Some will be abandoned. And in 1,000 years or 10,000, will our descendants tell stories about the great cities swallowed by the sea? Will they wonder who we were and what we knew? Will they dig through the rubble and try to piece together our history, finding fragments that don't quite fit the story they've been told? Will they ask the same question we're asking now? What if there was something before? And the answer will be yes. There was us, just as there were people before us. And before them. This is the cycle. This is the pattern. Rise and fall. Build and lose. Remember and forget. But here's the difference. We have a choice. We have the knowledge, the technology, the awareness to break the cycle, or at least to smooth it. To preserve what's important. To adapt before the crisis becomes catastrophe. To learn from the drowned lands, not by finding them, but by recognizing what they represent. They represent warning, hubris, the illusion of permanence, the reality that the earth is mightier than any civilization, and that nature does not negotiate. But they also represent resilience, survival, the determination to carry forward, to rebuild, to remember, the refusal to let knowledge die. And that's what we must carry forward now. Not the arrogance of thinking we're the pinnacle, but the humility of knowing we're part of a continuum. Not the despair of thinking collapse is inevitable, but the hope that memory is stronger than forgetting. The drowned lands are still there, beneath the waves, silent, patient, waiting. They hold secrets we may never uncover, stories we may never hear, evidence we may never find. But they also hold a truth, that we are not the first, and we will not be the last. That civilizations rise and fall, but humanity endures. That the water comes, the world changes, and we adapt. Or we don't. The choice is ours. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, as the words fade and the darkness settles, think about the drowned lands. Think about the people who lived there, who watched the sea rise, who gathered their families and fled inland, carrying stories. Think about the generations that followed, who built cities and temples and libraries, who encoded knowledge in stone and star and song, hoping it would last. Think about yourself. Right now, in this moment, a link in a chain stretching back tens of thousands of years and forward into an unknowable future. You are a descendant of survivors, You carry their memory in your genes, your language, your culture. You stand on the shoulders of the drowned and the displaced, the remembered and the forgotten. And the question is, what will you carry forward? What story will you tell? What knowledge will you preserve? What will you build that lasts not in stone, but in minds, in communities, in the choices you make about how to live on this fragile, beautiful, changing planet? The drowned lands cannot answer. They lie silent beneath the waves, their voices lost to salt and time. But you can answer. You are the answer. You are the memory, still living, still breathing, still carrying forward the story of where we came from. Even if that place no longer exists, even if it never did, because in the end, the place doesn't matter as much as the journey. The homeland is less important than the road, and the drowned lands, real or imagined, serve the same purpose. They remind us to look deeper, to question more, to honor the past while building the future. They remind us that history is not a line, but a spiral, that we return again and again to the same questions, the same challenges, the same choices. And each time we have the chance to choose differently, to choose memory over forgetting, connection over isolation, preservation over exploitation, to choose, in other words, to survive, not just as individuals, but as a species, as a culture, as a living memory that refuses to drown. So thank you for being here, for listening, for wondering, for asking the questions that don't have easy answers. If this resonated with you, if it stirred something deep, consider sharing it. Consider exploring further. Consider being part of the conversation about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. And tell me, where are you listening from? What corner of the world do you call home? What stories do your people tell about the past? Because every story matters. Every memory is a thread. And together, we weave the tapestry that connects us all. The living and the drowned, the remembered and the forgotten, the lost lands and the new worlds we're building now. Sleep well. Dream of the deep. And when you wake, remember, you are part of something older and greater than you know. The drowned lands lie beneath us, but we rise above them, and we carry them forward, always into the light. There's a coda to all of this, a final thought that lingers even after the evidence has been laid out, the myths examined, the questions asked. It's about us, about now, about what it means to live in an age where we're only beginning to understand how much we don't know. We're living through a strange moment in human history. We have more information than any previous generation. More data, more tools, more capacity to analyze and understand the past. We've mapped the human genome. We've peered back to the edge of the universe. We've decoded ancient languages that were lost for millennia. And yet, the more we learn, the more mysteries we uncover. Göbekli Tepe appears, rewriting the timeline of civilization. The Denisovans emerge from a single-finger bone, revealing a whole branch of humanity we never knew existed. Ancient structures align with astronomical precision we can barely explain. And beneath the waves, the continental shelves wait, holding secrets we've barely begun to explore. It's humbling, and it should be, because for so long we've told ourselves a comforting story, that we know the past, that history is settled, that the textbooks are complete. Like the narrative of progress, of humanity climbing steadily upward from caves to cities, from ignorance to enlightenment. It's clean. It's linear. It makes sense. But the drowned lands disrupt that narrative. They suggest something messier. They suggest that history doesn't move in straight lines, but in waves. That civilizations don't just rise, they also fall. That knowledge isn't only gained, it's also lost. That we're not at the end of the story, but somewhere in the middle, still figuring it out, still piecing together the fragments. And that's okay. In fact, it's beautiful, because it means there's still mystery in the world. Still discovery. Still wonder. Consider what it would mean if we found something. If tomorrow, a submersible descending to the floor of the Java Sea discovered a structure, walls, foundations, something undeniably artificial. If carbon dating placed it at 12,000 years old. If it showed evidence of planning, of engineering, of culture, the world would convulse. Not just archaeology but philosophy, religion, politics. Every certainty would be questioned. Every timeline rewritten. Every assumption about human capacity, human history, human origins, upended. Some would celebrate. Some would deny. Some would weaponize it, using it to promote fringe theories or undermine established science. It would be messy, chaotic, contentious, but ultimately it would be growth. Because the truth, however uncomfortable, is better than comfortable ignorance. And the questions, the big, unsettling questions, are what drive us forward. What if we don't find anything? What if the drowned lands remain silent, their secrets locked beneath silt and time, inaccessible despite our best technology? That's okay too, because the search itself matters. The asking of questions. The willingness to look beyond the accepted narrative and consider alternatives. The humility to admit we might be wrong. This is what science is supposed to be. Not dogma, not certainty, but inquiry, exploration, the constant refinement of understanding in the face of new evidence. And the drowned lands, whether they yield ruins or remain enigmatic, serve that purpose. They keep us curious. They keep us humble. They remind us that the earth is old, humanity is complex, and history is deeper than we imagine. Now let's talk about something else. Something personal. You've been listening for a while now. Maybe you're in bed, lights off, eyes closed. Maybe you're driving, the road dark ahead. Maybe you're somewhere else entirely, walking, working, drifting. But wherever you are, you're here. Engaging with ideas that don't offer easy answers. Wrestling with questions that challenge what you've been taught. And that says something about you. It says you're not satisfied with surface explanations. You want depth. You want nuance. You want to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. And that's rare. In a world of algorithms feeding us content designed to confirm what we already believe, you've chosen something different. Something slower. Something that requires thought. So thank you, truly. Because this kind of engagement, this willingness to sit with complexity, to embrace uncertainty, is how we grow. As individuals, as a culture, as a species. The drowned lands are a metaphor in the end. They represent everything we've forgotten. Every piece of knowledge lost. Every story untold. Every person who lived and died without leaving a trace. Whose hopes and fears and discoveries vanished into time. But they also represent possibility. The possibility that we're more than we think we are. That we come from more than we know. That our ancestors, far from being primitive, were us. Facing the same challenges, asking the same questions, trying to survive and thrive in a world that didn't care whether they succeeded. And they did succeed. They survived. They adapted. They built. They taught. They passed forward what they could, hoping it would be enough. It was because we're here, and we're still asking questions, still building, still trying to understand. The cycle continues. But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a cycle. Could be a spiral. Rising with each turn, retaining more, losing less, learning faster. That's the hope, anyway, that we can take the lessons of the drowned lands, the fragility, the resilience, the importance of memory, and apply them now, before the next catastrophe, before the next flood, because the water is rising, not as fast as it did during the melt pulses, but it's rising, and we can see it coming. We have time, not a lot, but some. Enough to choose differently, to build differently, to remember differently. And maybe, just maybe, if we do that, the next generation won't have to rediscover what we lost. They won't have to ask, what if there was something before? Because they'll know. We'll have told them. We'll have preserved it. In libraries and archives, yes, but also in culture, in education, in the stories we tell and the values we pass on. We can be the generation that breaks the cycle, or at least bends it. We can be the bridge, but only if we remember, only if we look back even when it's uncomfortable, only if we take seriously the possibility that we're not the first, and we won't be the last, and that humility, real, deep humility, is the foundation of wisdom. The drowned lands teach us that. They lie beneath the waves, silent and patient, holding truths we may never fully know. But their existence alone, their possibility, is enough. Enough to make us question. enough to make us wonder, enough to make us try. So as you drift now, as the words fade into the background and sleep takes hold, carry this with you. You are part of a long, long story, longer than you've been told, deeper than you imagine. And the ending isn't written yet. The drowned lands are gone, but we remain. And in our remembering, in our questioning, in our refusal to accept easy answers, we honor them. We honor everyone who came before, everyone who survived the flood, everyone who carried forward the knowledge, the stories, the hope. And we become part of that chain, that unbroken lineage of survivors, builders, dreamers. The water may rise, the world may change, but as long as we remember, as long as we ask, as long as we care, the story continues. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Good night. Thank you for listening. And may you dream of the deep. Let's end where we began, but with different eyes. With the knowledge we've gathered, the patterns we've traced, the stories we've listened to. Let's end with a question that isn't really a question anymore, but a recognition. What if human civilization began in a place that no longer exists? It did. Not in a single location, but in many. Along every coastline that drowned. In every valley that flooded. On every plain that was swallowed when the ice released its grip and the seas came rushing back. Our true origins lie scattered beneath the waves, buried under sediment, eroded by currents, lost to the darkness of the deep. And the civilizations we know, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, the Yellow River, Mesoamerica, they're not the start. They're the continuation, the echo, the memory made solid. We've spent this entire journey tracing that echo backward, following it through myth and geology, through genetics and linguistics, through the alignment of stones and the persistence of stories. And everywhere we looked, we found the same thing. Evidence not of isolated invention, but of shared origin, of connection, of something older. And now you know, or at least you suspect. And that suspicion is enough, because it changes how you see history. It adds depth where there was flatness, complexity where there was simplicity, mystery where there was certainty. You'll never look at a flood myth the same way again. You'll never dismiss ancient stories as mere allegory. You'll never assume that the past was simpler than the present. Because you've seen the layers. You've peered beneath the surface. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. This is what deep history does. It unsettles. It challenges. It refuses to let us rest in comfortable narratives. It insists that we look harder, think deeper, question more. And in doing so, it makes us better, more thoughtful, more humble, more connected to the vast span of time that stretches behind and ahead of us. The drowned lands are not just a historical curiosity. They're a reminder, a warning, a gift. They remind us that nothing lasts forever, that the places we call home, the cities we build, the coastlines we love, they're all temporary, borrowed from the earth for a time, vulnerable to forces we can't control. They warn us that collapse is possible, that civilizations, no matter how advanced, can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that if we're not careful, we too will become the drowned, our achievements buried, our stories forgotten. And they offer us a gift, the knowledge that we've survived before, that humanity is resilient, that even when the world changes, even when everything is lost, we adapt. We carry forward, we remember, and we rebuild. That's the story of the drowned lands. Not a story of endings, but of continuations. Of the refusal to let disaster be the final word. Of the stubborn, beautiful insistence that we will go on. And we have, for thousands of years. Through floods and droughts, ice ages and warming periods, collapse and renaissance. We've endured, and we will endure still. But endurance isn't passive. It's not just survival. It's active. It's choosing to remember, to learn, to grow. It's taking the lessons of the past and using them to build a better future. That's the work ahead of us. And it's not easy. It requires humility. It requires listening to the myths, to the earth, to the voices of those who came before. It requires action, not just to prevent collapse, but to build systems, cultures, and knowledge that can weather the changes ahead. The seas are rising. The climate is shifting. The world is changing. just as it did 10,000 years ago. And we have a choice. We can ignore it, deny it, hope it goes away. Or we can face it, adapt, prepare. We can honor the drowned lands by refusing to join them. And we can honor the survivors, our ancestors, by carrying forward what they gave us. The stories, the knowledge, the resilience, because they didn't give up. And neither can we. So this is where the journey ends. Not with answers, but with awareness. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with conclusions, but with continuation. The drowned lands are still there, beneath the waves, silent, waiting, holding their secrets. But we're here above the water, living, breathing, asking. And as long as we ask, as long as we wonder, as long as we remember, they're not truly lost. They live in us, in our questions, in our stories, in our refusal to accept that history is simple, that the past is settled, that we know everything there is to know. They live in every myth that speaks of a flood, in every structure aligned with the stars, in every language that carries unexpected connections, in every discovery that challenges what we thought we knew. They live in you, so carry them forward. Share the stories. Ask the questions. Look deeper. Think bigger. Connect the dots that others dismiss. Because the drowned lands aren't just history. They're prophecy. They're warning. They're hope. They're us. And the story isn't over. It's only just beginning. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening, for wondering, for staying curious in a world that often rewards certainty over inquiry. If you found something valuable here, something that stirred your mind or touched your heart, share it, pass it forward. Let others join the conversation. Because these questions, these deep, ancient, essential questions, they're too important to keep to ourselves. And tell me, what do you think? Do you believe there were civilizations before the ones we know? Do you think the drowned lands hold secrets we've yet to uncover? Or do you think the myths are just myths, the patterns just coincidence, the mysteries just gaps in our knowledge waiting to be filled with mundane explanations? Either way, you're part of the story now, part of the ongoing conversation about who we are and where we came from. And that matters. You matter. So sleep well. Dream of the deep. And when you wake, look at the world with new eyes. Eyes that see not just what is, but what was, and what might be. The drowned lands lie beneath us, but the future stretches ahead, and it's ours to shape. Good night. There's one final thing, a thought that's been hovering at the edges of everything we've discussed, waiting for the right moment to surface. And now, as we near the true end, it's time to name it. What if the drowned lands aren't the only thing we've lost? What if the real loss isn't cities or coastlines or artifacts, but something deeper, something intangible? Memory, continuity, connection. We live in a world fragmented by time. The past is a foreign country, as the saying goes. We look at ancient peoples as fundamentally different from us, primitive, superstitious, limited. We imagine they saw the world in ways we've outgrown, that they believe things we've disproven, that they lived in darkness while we live in light. But what if that's wrong? What if they were us? Not metaphorically, literally. The same brains, the same capacity for thought, for wonder, for insight, the same fears and hopes and dreams. The only difference is time, and what time has erased. If you were born 10,000 years ago, on a coastal plain that no longer exists, you would have looked at the stars with the same awe we feel. You would have loved your children with the same intensity. You would have feared death, sought meaning, wondered about your place in the universe. You would have asked the same questions we're asking now. And maybe, just maybe, you would have found some of the same answers. Because the thing about knowledge is that it's not cumulative in a straight line. It doesn't just pile up generation after generation until we reach some ultimate pinnacle. It can be lost, forgotten, erased. And when it's lost, we have to start over. Not from absolute zero, but from wherever the survivors landed. And they start with whatever they carried. This is what the drowned lands teach us in the end. Not that there was a single, great, lost supercivilization with crystal technology and anti-gravity ships, though that makes for good fiction. But that there were people. People who lived, who thought, who learned. who developed knowledge adapted to their environment, who thrived in places that no longer exist. And when those places were destroyed, the knowledge fragmented. Some was preserved, some was lost, some was distorted beyond recognition. And we, their descendants, have been trying to piece it back together ever since. That's the real story of human history. Not progress, not decline, but cycles of memory and forgetting, of knowledge gained, lost, and slowly, painfully rediscovered. We didn't invent agriculture. We remembered it. We didn't invent writing. We reinvented it, reconstructing a tool our ancestors might have used in forms we can no longer recognize. We didn't invent astronomy. We looked up at the same stars they watched and relearned the patterns. We're not the first people to wonder about our origins. We're just the first in this particular cycle to have the tools to search for answers beneath the waves. And what we find or don't find will shape the next turn of the wheel. But here's the paradox. The more we search for the drowned lands, the more we realize they're not really lost. They're in us, encoded in our DNA, embedded in our languages, preserved in our myths, carried forward in the knowledge we've rebuilt. The drowned lands didn't vanish. They transformed. From geography into memory, from physical space into cultural space, from land into story. And story is more durable than stone, because stone can be buried. But a story, if it's told and retold, if it's sung and remembered, if it's passed from parent to child across generations, a story can survive anything, even a flood. So maybe the question isn't, where were the drowned lands? Maybe the question is, what are they now? And the answer is, they're here. In the myths we still tell, in the structures we still build, in the questions we still ask, in the way we look at the ocean and feel a pull we can't quite explain, a longing for something lost, a memory of something we never experienced but somehow know. The drowned lands are in us. We are the drowned lands. We carry them forward with every step. And when we tell these stories, when we ask these questions, we're not looking backward. We're looking inward. We're excavating not the seabed but ourselves, trying to remember what we've forgotten, trying to reconnect with the part of us that still knows, deep down, that we're older than we think, deeper than we've been told. This is why these stories matter. Not because they give us facts, though they might, but because they give us meaning. They give us context. They give us a sense of belonging to something larger than our individual lives, our single lifetimes, our brief moment on this ancient earth. They remind us that we're part of a continuum, that we're links in a chain stretching back to the drowned coasts and forward into an unknowable future, that our actions matter, that our choices echo, and that the best way to honor those who came before, the survivors, the builders, the rememberers, is to remember them, to tell their stories, to carry forward the knowledge, to refuse to let the cycle of forgetting repeat. That's the work. That's the calling. That's the responsibility. Not to dig up ruins, though that would be extraordinary, but to dig into ourselves, to reconnect with the ancient memory, to listen to the myths, to respect the earth, to build with humility and care, to be, in other words, worthy descendants. And I think we can. I think we are. Because you're here. You listened. You wondered. You engaged with ideas that don't offer comfort or certainty, but challenge and complexity. And that's enough. That's the seed. That's the beginning of remembering. So let this be the end, but also the beginning. The end of this story. The beginning of your engagement with it. Let the drowned lands live in you. Let them shape how you see history, how you see the world, how you see yourself. Let them remind you that you're part of something vast and old and beautiful, that you carry the legacy of survivors, that you stand on the shoulders of those who refused to let disaster be the final word. And let them inspire you to ask better questions, to seek deeper truths, to honor the past by building a future worth remembering. Because someday, far from now, someone might tell stories about us, about the people who lived at the turning point, when the seas rose again and the climate shifted. They'll wonder what we knew, what we did, whether we learned from the drowned lands or whether we joined them. And the answer to that question, the answer that will be told in the myths of the future, depends on what we do now. So choose well. Remember deeply. Carry forward. The drowned lands are silent. But you are not. Speak. Remember. Build. And in doing so, honor everyone who came before. Everyone who survived the flood. Everyone who carried the memory forward. Across millennia and oceans. To you. You are the answer to their hope. The fulfillment of their effort. The proof that memory, despite everything, endures. And that's the most beautiful thing of all. Thank you. For everything. For listening. For being here. For carrying this forward. The story doesn't end. It never does. It just changes shape. And the next shape is yours. Before we part, I want to give you one more image. One more scene to carry with you into sleep, into dreams, into whatever comes next. Imagine this ashore. Not a shore, but one that existed long ago. The sand is white, worn smooth by the tides of thousands of years. The water is clear, shallow, stretching out for miles before deepening into blue. Behind the shore, a forest. Not dense jungle, but open woodland, dotted with palms and flowering trees. The air is warm, but not oppressive. A breeze moves through, carrying the scent of salt and green growth. And on the shore, a settlement. Not grand, not monumental, just a collection of shelters built on stilts, thatched with reeds, simple but sturdy. Smoke rises from cook fires. Children play in the shallows. Boats rest on the sand, carved from single logs, their prows carved with patterns that mean something to the people who made them. An elder sits at the edge of the village, watching the horizon. The sun is setting, painting the water gold and red. The elder knows the tides, knows the stars, knows the seasons, knows when to plant, when to fish, when to move. The elder also knows something else. Knows that the water is different than it was when they were young. That the shore is closer to the village now. That every year it seems the land shrinks. The elder has seen entire groves disappear. Seen beaches where they played as a child now submerged. Seen islands in the distance vanish beneath the waves. And the elder knows, without being able to name it, that something is changing. Something is ending. The children don't know yet. They play unaware. But the elder watches, and wonders, and begins to tell stories. Stories about the land as it was. About the places that are gone. About the ancestors who lived when the shore was farther out, when the world was larger. And the children listen, not because they understand, but because the elder's voice is soothing, because the rhythm of the words is comforting, because stories are what you do when the sun sets and the work is done. And in that moment, in that simple act of an elder telling stories to children on a shore that will someday vanish, memory is born. That's how it happened. Not with grand declarations or carved monuments, but with voices, with stories told quietly, insistently, again and again, until they became part of the fabric of the people. And when the water finally came, when the shore was lost, when the people moved inland and everything changed, the stories remained. Filtered, distorted, mythologized, but there. And thousands of years later, we hear them, and we wonder, and we search, and we ask, was there really a place that drowned? Was there really a time before? And the answer, echoing back across the millennia, is yes. Yes, there was. And the elder who told the stories, whose name we'll never know, whose face we'll never see, whose grave is now 100 feet underwater, that elder succeeded. The memory survived. You're hearing it now. That's the power of story. That's the power of memory. That's why the drowned lands, even lost, still live. Because someone somewhere long ago decided to remember, and to pass it forward. To you. And now it's your turn. You don't have to discover ruins. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to become an archaeologist or a historian. You just have to remember, and to tell, and to pass it forward. Tell someone about the drowned lands, about the myths, about the flood, about the possibility that history is older and stranger than we've been taught. Not as dogma, not as certainty, but as wonder, as invitation, as a door open to questions worth asking. And in doing that, you become part of the chain, part of the lineage, part of the unbroken thread that connects the elder on the vanished shore to the listener in the distant future. You become the story, and the story continues. It always continues. That's what I want you to carry with you. Not just information, not just speculation, but the sense that you're part of something larger, that your curiosity, your wonder, your willingness to question, it connects you to everyone who came before who did the same, to the Sumerian scribe who preserved the flood story in cuneiform, to the Egyptian priest who told Solon about the drowned land, to the Polynesian navigator who sang of Hawaii, to the Aboriginal elder who remembered the coastlines, to the modern archaeologist who dares to look beneath the waves. You're part of that lineage now, and it's an honor, privilege, a responsibility, so carry it well. Remember deeply, ask boldly, wonder endlessly, and when the time comes, when someone asks you, what do you think about the past, about where we came from, about what's been lost, tell them about the drowned lands, about the flood, about the possibility that we're not the first, and we won't be the last. Tell them that history is deeper than they think, that memory is stronger than stone, that humanity is older, stranger, more resilient than we've been taught. And tell them to look beneath the waves, not with submersibles or sonar, though that would help, but with imagination, with curiosity, with the willingness to see what's been hidden, to ask what's been forgotten, to remember what's been lost, because the drowned lands are waiting, not to be found necessarily, but to be remembered, and in remembering them we remember ourselves, who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of. That's the gift of the drowned lands. Not answers, but the reminder that we're capable of asking. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Thank you for journeying with me, through myths and oceans, through time and memory, through the drowned places and the stories that survived them. May you sleep deeply. May you dream of shores that no longer exist. May you wake with a sense of wonder, knowing that you're part of a story older and grander than you imagined. And may you carry it forward, always forward, into the light. Good night. Silence now, or nearly, just the sound of your breathing, the soft hum of the world around you, the darkness settling in, gentle and complete. Let the drowned lands fade. Let the questions dissolve. Let the search for answers drift away like sediment settling onto the ocean floor. You've heard the stories. You've traced the patterns. You've walked the shores of places that no longer exist and listened to the echoes of voices that have been silent for 10,000 years. And now rest. Let it all integrate. Let it sink into the deep places of your mind, where memory and dream intertwine. Let it become part of you, not as knowledge to be recalled, but as knowing something deeper, older, felt rather than thought. Because that's how the ancients carried their wisdom. Not in databases or books, but in the body, in the rhythm of story and song, in the quiet knowing that comes from listening, truly listening to the world. You've listened tonight, and in listening you've honored them, the ones who came before, the ones who survived, the ones who remembered, and now you become the silence, the space between stories, the pause before the next telling. Rest in that space, be held by it. The drowned lands are still there, beneath the waves, silent and patient, holding their secrets, waiting for the day when we might finally understand. But tonight, they don't need to be understood. They just need to be felt, known, remembered. And you've done that. You've remembered. And in remembering, you've brought them, if only for a moment, back to life. That's enough. That's the work. That's the gift. So sleep now. Deep and dreamless or full of visions, it doesn't matter. Either way, you've done what needed to be done. You've listened. You've wondered. You've asked. And the drowned lands heard you. And so did I. Thank you for being here, for staying curious, for refusing to let the past be simple. You are part of the story now, forever. Sleep well, and may you wake remembering. And finally, in the quietest moment, when all words have nearly faded and only the darkness remains, let me leave you with this. The drowned lands don't need us to find them. They need us to become them. to carry forward what was lost, to remember what was forgotten, to honor the past by refusing to let it die in obscurity. They need us to ask the questions, to wonder at the mysteries, to challenge the stories we've been told and seek deeper truths. They need us to be curious, to be humble, to be brave. And you are. You've proven that by being here, by listening, by caring. So this isn't goodbye. It's not an ending. It's a passing forward, a continuation. The story doesn't end with me. It never did. It ends and begins with you. So go now. Carry it forward. Into your dreams. Into your days. Into the conversations you have and the thoughts you hold. Carry the drowned lands with you. Not as burden but as gift. As reminder. As wonder. And when someone asks you, what do you believe about the past? About where we came from? About what's been lost? You'll know what to say. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with answers, but with better questions. And that's how memory survives. That's how the drowned lands live on. Through you, through us, forever. Good night, and thank you for everything. Now true silence. No more words, no more stories, no more questions. Just the quiet, the deep, the space where all things rest. Let it hold you. Let it carry you into sleep. The drowned lands are there, beneath the waves, beneath your thoughts, beneath everything. And you are here, above the water, still breathing, still wondering. That's the miracle. That's the hope. That's the story. Rest now. You've earned it. Sleep, silence, breath, deep, rest. And in the end, beneath it all, in the deepest part of the night, when words have dissolved and stories have faded and even silence has become a kind of sound, there is only this memory, endless, patient, waiting, like the drowned lands themselves, forever.